Good to be here. Thank you to Charleswood United Church for hosting this great event. Looks like it's an exciting one. I just got here, but looking forward to this afternoon. So the title of my talk is this. It's The World is Our Parish, Ministry and the Intersection of the Church and New Social Movements. And I'll be talking about new social movements such as Idle No More and Black Lives Matter and so on today. So we can move ahead. But before I do that, I thought since we have a group of theologians here, I would begin with theological justification from the Bible, no less. And so this is from Philippians 4, verse 8. Finally, beloved, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is pleasing, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, and if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. And so I chose that because it's not whatever is true in the world of religion, but whatever is true in the world. We can move on. But those who know me know that I'm not going to only have biblical sources. So I want to introduce you to my friend Judith Butler. And Judith Butler is a great philosopher. Her notion of bodies that matter is one that's really vital to thinking about movements such as Occupy Wall Street and the Arab Spring, Idle No More, and Black Lives Matter. Because she's arguing that we live in a time of enormous precarity. And what these new social movements do is they give people a space where they can appear in the public, and they can, just by their public witness, they can show their protest against the precariousness of their lives. Depending on the various kinds of circumstances that they're protesting, what they hold in common is the precarity of this world, and their existence as bodies being on the street is a lived protest. It's a performance which displays their unwillingness to conform or to capitulate to the powers and principalities. See, I can be biblical of our time. So this is what she says. When bodies assemble on the street, in the square, or in other forms of public space, including virtual ones, very important for these movements, they are exercising a plural and performative right to appear, one that delivers a bodily demand for a more livable set of economic, social, political conditions, no longer afflicted by induced forms of precarity. We can move on. So I want to introduce you to a number of theologians who've been thinking along those lines with Judith Butler about the significance of movements such as Black Lives Matter to the church. And this is Pamela Lightsey. She's the Associate Dean for Community Life and Lifelong Learning at Boston University School of Theology. She's also an ordained minister in the United Methodist Church. And she wrote this book titled Lives Matter, A Womanist Queer Theology. And Lightsey talks about the Black Lives Matter, and she notes the lack of existence and the lack of leadership among the church. That we have this incredible outpouring of the Spirit in the Black Lives Matter movement, but the church is virtually invisible and virtually silent. And yet the Spirit is moving among these youth, to be sure. And she writes this: I have longed for an all-out presence of faith communities and their respective leadership protesting on the streets against excessive policing and unjust laws impacting the daily lives of Black people. None of my United Methodist bishops participated in the Black Lives Matter protests in Ferguson or Baltimore, with notable exceptions. The theological language of love, the sacredness of life, and righteousness has been invoked largely by young activists without any overt religious affiliation. And you think about how different that is from the civil rights movement, where, leaders such as MLK clearly had very strong religious affiliations and were at the forefront of the civil rights movement. This is a different movement, no less spiritual, but not as affiliated with overt religious practices. They have shown us that neither the language nor hopeful practices are limited to religion. And the next one. And she goes on to say, yes, religion is pervasive in Black communities, but the movement for Black lives contains activists from a variety of contexts, including atheists, agnostics, and those who identify as spiritual but not religious. This suggests to me that what is really happening in this movement is out of the hands of the church. It is out of the hands of the church and into the streets, to use a modified version of one of our protest chants. End quote. So I think this is very good news indeed, that it is out of our churches and out of the confines of our four walls, and it's onto the streets, and it's spilling onto the streets, this spirited movement in various forms, where I think the church can gather energy and can also belong to movements where bodies matter, where bodies actually protest the precarity of our lives. Next slide. So you know some of these movements, and just to bring you up to speed on how these movements work, they tend to be late 20th and early 21st century movements. They're gatherings of people who are gathered together not necessarily for a common cause, although it might be a cause, but they don't have an overt agenda at the end of their protests. It's not like protesting the Vietnam War or protesting disarmament. There might be a more amorphous cause. It's a movement that contains people who are loosely gathered together, and they're gathered together not only on the streets, but also through social media. Another important feature of this movement, it is very much youth-based. It is a young movement in which young people are taking the leadership. Leadership is also important in new social movements because there isn't much by way of leadership. You don't see one figure like an MLK who's standing out above all the others. Often it's a group of people who are getting together to start things. It's a space where there's a recognition of the various diversity. You may be religious, you may be non-religious, and so on. It's facilitated, as I said, by social media, and it also gives a space for alternative forms of human flourishing, and that's very important here, because I would say that this gathering is a religious gathering in itself. And it displays through the very activities of bodies, round dancing in this case, an alternative form of spirituality and an alternative form of human flourishing. Next slide, please. This is Meet Me at the Bell Tower. Where's Adele? Adele, could you please wave? Adele Compton wrote her MA thesis on Meet Me at the Bell Tower and is one of the leaders among these youth leaders here in that community. And this, of course, here is in Winnipeg. Kids, young people getting together with no fixed or firmed agenda, but to support the life of other youth in the north end of Winnipeg. This is, some of you probably were there, the first Steinbach Pride Parade. Now, Pride has been around for a long time, but as you probably know, there were protests against the Pride Parade in 2016 in Steinbach, and of course there were some protests in Steinbach against educational reforms that would attend to the needs of kids who are LGBTQ. So the first Steinbach Pride Parade was a very important moment of witness within that community because there were so many protests that were at least suggested. MLAs refused to come. You probably remember that as well. But what's interesting about filling the streets of Steinbach at Pride, looking as colorful as these folks are looking, is that they present by their very bodily appearance an alternative form of family, one that's different from what the normal script is of what a family is within that context. Again, we'll have to give a shout out to the Anglicans with the next one. There's our friend Gwen McAllister. Some of you may know her in her lovely cassock and her Pride Parade. That's also at the Steinbach Pride Parade. We can move on. A very important protest in which the clergy were indeed very much visible and leaders was in Charlottesville in 2017. And those of you, you probably remember what happened in Charlottesville, where there was this group of Trump-supporting neo-fascist, neo-Nazi, Unite the Right folks who were protesting the demise, apparently, of white supremacy, like that's something to protest. But what was very interesting about this was that a number of leaders from all faith communities came, and there was a standoff between them and these very right-wing paramilitary groups that you can see on the right. And these are ordinary clergy like most of us here, right? And they didn't do anything that was overt in terms of any evangelization. They didn't wear, overt signs of their religious affiliation. They didn't have placards, unlike the other sorts of people there. They didn't protest loudly as a counter-protest. They simply stood there And sometimes they sang, these very humble songs like This Little Light of Mine. And just by their standing there, their presence, they performed, as Butler would say, an alternative narrative to the violence and the deadly racism that has been infecting the United States since forever, but really has gotten a new lease on life since Trump. And we've got a couple of more. Yes. So here are the protesters in Charlottesville, a wonderful example. You can see Cornel West in the front there and a number of other prominent leaders. And again, their protest was largely silent. It wasn't, the jingoistic, rah-rah, here we are, religious figures, we're going to save the world. It was something much more modest, something much more humble, simply marching quietly, peacefully through the streets as these deadly sorts of right-wing kinds of protests were going on. One more minute. I just wanted to conclude with a few vignettes from young people. It's incredible to see the March for Our Lives and how youth have led this movement. Some of the leaders being as young as 11 years old, such as the young Naomi Wadler, who made a wonderful speech that I hope that you all saw. These movements are ones that are tragic in the sense that no 11-year-old should be protesting gun violence. And nevertheless, it is, I think, a sign of tremendous hope for the future, and hope that the Spirit is alive, not necessarily in our churches, but it is in the world. And it is our responsibility, I think, as Christian leaders, to listen to those movements of the Spirit and to be present among those movements, and to bring those back into our churches to show how these are places of livelihood and spirit and protest, where we can actually present ourselves as an alternative form to the precariousness, to the deadliness, to the violence that so characterizes our time. And I think I have one more. This is my final homily. What if these kids are the answer to our thoughts and prayers? What if they are? I believe they are, and I believe that the church must be listening. Thanks very much.